My name is Tessa Marchetti, and I am 26 years old. At 9:41 a.m. on the Friday, my sister erased me from Dad's will in Orleans Parish Probate Court. The room smelled like lemon polish, rainwater, and old wool coats that had not finished drying. The brass calipers in my bag were cold against my palm through the canvas. Rhoda sat 2 rows ahead of me in pearls and a pale blue dress, smiling at the preservation committee behind her. Like probate was a ribbon cutting, and Dad was a wing being named after a donor. My sister had hidden Dad's final will and brought a forged version that cut me out of the house, the insurance account, and the trumpet archive he had asked me to restore. Then she stood at the bench and called me a shop girl in front of 86 people, as if my hands were proof that I did not belong in my own father's estate. She said it softly. She said it on purpose. She wanted the preservation committee to remember the word longer than they remembered me. I did not move. I counted the seconds between her sentence and the next sound in the room. 4. The court reporter's keys clicked once. A man behind me coughed into his fist. Rhoda touched her pearls and smiled again. She thought a forged signature could become family history if she said it in a courtroom. By 4 p.m., Judge Morrow would be looking at the thumbprint she forgot to bury. Welcome to By Then I Knew, where quiet people remember what loud families try to rename, and justice often arrives with a date, a witness, and one document kept in the right place. If stories about dignified justice and family truth matter to you, subscribe and stay with me. Drop your city and what time it is where you're listening from. I like knowing where these stories are being heard. Now let me take you back to the first time my sister taught me that work could be useful and still be treated like shame. I was 9 years old at a school heritage night in a cafeteria humid enough that the paper flags drooped at their corners. The room smelled like red beans, floor wax, and the warm cardboard of pizza boxes stacked on a folding table by the door. Rain tapped against the high windows in long, lazy patterns the janitor would later complain about because the tile was wet for 2 days. Dad had brought his trumpet because my teacher had asked, and because Dad believed children should hear adults work at things that took breath. I had helped him for 2 evenings. The trumpet case had a hinge that no longer closed flat, and one corner of the latch had bent slightly inward from being dropped at a wedding the year before. Etta sat with me at her kitchen table on a Wednesday and showed me how to use a small clamp she kept in her sewing drawer next to her crawfish-shaped pin magnet. She did not call it fixing. She called it listening to the case, until it agreed to close again. I tightened the brass hinge 3 turns. Exactly 3. I remember the number, because Etta hummed the count under her breath each time. Rhoda was 16 that night, already polished beyond her age, already practicing the way she would later be in rooms with money in them. She wore a navy cardigan she had borrowed from our mother and a small string of fake pearls Lucille had ordered from a catalog. While Dad sat up in the corner, Rhoda walked around the cafeteria, telling 3 different adults that she had organized the evening, chosen Dad's song, and kept me busy with crafts so the family could focus on the performance. My teacher, Mrs. Abushan, complimented the case. She lifted the lid carefully because she knew Dad's trumpet was 40 years old and that the felt inside had been hand replaced. She said the hinge closed cleanly and she had not seen one fixed that well in some time. Rhoda laughed. Her laugh was clean, social, designed for adults. Tessa likes the little messy jobs, she said. I handle the presentation. I felt the metal taste of trumpet oil in the air, even though I was nowhere near the bell. My wrist stuck to the cafeteria table where someone had spilled juice an hour earlier and wiped it with a napkin that did not absorb anything. I did not correct Rhoda. Dad did not correct her either, because Dad was thinking about his opening note, and adults do not correct things in front of teachers if they do not have to. That night, I learned the shape of what would happen for the next 17 years. Rhoda would take the public credit. I would do the work in advance. The room would call her organized, and call me crafty, and never notice that the case closed only because somebody had counted 3 turns of a brass hinge at a kitchen table on a Wednesday. By the time I was 17, Dad had been booked to play at a Veterans Day breakfast at the American Legion Hall, and the latch on his trumpet case had cracked along the seam where the inner spring rested. The crack would not have killed the case. It would have killed his confidence, because Dad believed an instrument arrived the way its keeper arrived, and a broken latch was an apology in advance. I repaired it in his back room. Dad taught trumpet there to neighborhood kids 3 afternoons a week under a ceiling fan that turned slowly enough to be a kind of metronome. The room smelled like valve oil, dust, chicory coffee from his blue tin cup, and the warm paper of sheet music stacked in milk crates along the wall. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked steadily for the last 8 minutes of Dad's scales, as if it had a part in the lesson. The repair took 42 minutes. I cut a new spring channel from a strip of brass I had bought from a hardware store on Magazine, polished it with a soft cloth, and fitted under the original latch so the seam closed without any visible patchwork. The brass warmed under my thumb when I tightened the final screw. Rhoda was home from college that week, sitting on the porch with iced tea and a magazine, watching me bring the trumpet case out into the light to test it. She did not get up. She watched me close the latch 3 times to make sure the click was clean. She made a face I had learned to read by then, the one where her mouth softened but her eyes did not. "Don't encourage her, Dad," Rhoda said when Dad came out to inspect. "She'll start thinking props are the same as a career." Dad did not answer her. He turned the case over in his hands, opened it, closed it, opened it again. Then he went into the house and came back out with the brass calipers he had used since he taught shop class for 1 year in his 20s before he switched to music. He pressed them into my palm and folded my fingers around them. He said, quietly, that careful hands deserved tools that respected the work, and that I should keep these and not lend them out, and that I would know when to use them on something more important than a trumpet case. By the time I was 24, I was working at a museum on Esplanade as an exhibit fabricator, which meant that when the summer storm flooded the basement storage and damaged part of a neighborhood jazz collection, I was the one in cotton gloves with a flashlight at 1 a.m, lifting wet cardboard off handwritten music charts and trying to save what could be saved. I built a drying rack from scrap acrylic that night. I rescued 19 charts. The senior conservator told me the next morning that 19 was more than they had hoped for, and more than the insurance had budgeted to replace. There was a small donor dinner the following week. Lucille came in a dress she had bought for the occasion. She walked the room with Rhoda on one elbow, introducing her to donors as the daughter who was, as Lucille put it, finding her way into the cultural world of the city. When she got to me, near the back of the room next to the display lights I had set up an hour earlier, she did not change her tone. "Your sister knows how to speak to patrons," she said, to nobody in particular, and to me at the same time. "You know how to make things stand up." That was the family pattern in one sentence. Useful, but not honored. Necessary, but not named. The wet cardboard, the cold metal shelving, the 19 rescued charts, the rasp of cotton gloves against damp paper at 1 a.m. None of that was part of the introduction. The lights were. The truth was, the only person in our family who had ever called my work by its right name was Etta Karen, my grandmother on my mother's side. Etta lived in a shotgun house in the lower 9th that smelled of starch, magnolia soap, and the faint, sweet dust of old picture frames stacked along her hallway. She wore soft cotton house dresses that had been washed enough times to feel like a second layer of skin, and she kept her straight pins on the same crawfish-shaped magnet she had used since the 60s. In the spring of 2018, 3 months after Dad got his first serious diagnosis, I helped him inventory his service photograph, his trumpet lesson ledgers, and his medals. Etta sat at the small table in her front room with him, and I worked on the floor, separating things into archival sleeves the way I had learned at the museum. Rhoda had been in the house the week before. She had walked the hallway with a measuring app open on her phone, talking quietly to someone about the square footage of the back rooms. Etta did not name Rhoda. She did not accuse her. She asked Dad a question. She asked Dad whether he wanted his family to remember his wishes, or whether he wanted them to argue over his things. Dad did not answer right away. He looked at the trumpet on the table, the medals in their box, the framed photograph leaning against the wall, the one of him at 22 in dress uniform on the day he came home. Then he said he wanted to be remembered without a fight. Etta nodded once. She told him that pretty stories were easy to sell, and paper was harder to bully. She made a phone call to Beulah Knox, a retired notary she had known since church choir. Beulah came by the next afternoon. Dad signed 2 originals of his will at the kitchen table. Etta made sure the second one had a thumbprint page attached. She slipped that copy, in an archival sleeve, behind the backing paper of the framed service photograph. Then she screwed the backing down with a small flathead screw and made me promise I would not open the frame unless I had to. She put her hand over mine and said, in the slow, careful voice she used when something mattered, "Measure twice when love is loud." That was the first time the calipers became something other than a gift from Dad. That was the moment Etta turned them into instructions. There was one more thing she said that day. After Dad had gone home and the kettle had gone cold and the rain was starting again on the tin awning over her side yard. She told me that Rhoda did not want to be cruel. She wanted to be impressive, and that the trouble with people who wanted to be impressive was that they would eventually use somebody quieter to look bigger. She told me to keep my work, my notes, and my dates clean enough that a stranger could read them and know what had happened. 2 years later, at the museum, I built a humidity-safe support for a flood-damaged Mardi Gras Indian beadwork panel. The curator had asked me to mount it with a simple bracket. I had measured the panel, and the bracket would have pierced fragile fabric in 3 places. So I built a custom support that distributed the panel's weight across 11 contact points without putting a single pin through the original material. When the panel settled under glass, the senior conservator looked at it for a long time and said the piece was standing because I had known where not to touch it. I wrote the measurement notes, labeled the foam supports, and left the gallery before the donors arrived. I did not need to be in the photo. I needed the panel to still be intact in 20 years. Useful hands still deserve a name. The probate notice arrived at 7:18 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days before the objection deadline. I was in the museum fabrication shop, sanding the edge of an acrylic display riser, when my phone buzzed against the workbench. Rain was hitting the loading dock door in that steady New Orleans way that means it has decided to stay. The belt sander was warm. The dust on my fingers smelled faintly of plastic and citrus from the cleaner I had used the night before. I wiped my thumb on my apron before I unlocked the phone. The scanned probate document was 4 pages long. It named Rhoda Glenn as the sole heir to Dad's house on Burgundy Street and to the military insurance account he had carried since his discharge. It listed the Trumpet Archive as miscellaneous personal property. My name did not appear on any page. I did not call Rhoda. I did not call Lucille. I did not call anyone. I screenshotted every page. I printed the scan on the shop's color printer because the signatures would be easier to compare on physical paper than on a phone. I placed each printed page inside a clear sheet protector. I took a yellow pencil from my apron pocket and made a faint mark next to the signature line on page 3. The signature was too wide. Dad had a narrow, slanted hand. He pressed lightly, almost apologetically, on receipts. The signature on the probate document was even, heavy, and confidently centered between the underline and the printed name. The M in Marchetti had a long opening loop. Dad's M had been a small triangle for 50 years. I did not cry. I did not curse. I went into the cabinet where I kept old reference samples and pulled out 3 of Dad's lesson receipts that he had given me when I sorted his ledgers in 2018. I laid them under a magnifying lamp. I measured the signature width on each one with a ruler. None of them matched the probate signature. The probate signature was longer by 4 millimeters and slanted 3 degrees more upright. I sat at the workbench for 11 minutes. I counted. The sander cooled. The rain kept going. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first call was to Beulah Knox. Her name was in Etta's old address book, written in the neat, looping hand Etta used for people she trusted. Beside Beulah's name, Etta had written 2 words. "Will copy." Beulah answered her phone on the 3rd ring from what sounded like a kitchen. There was a small dog barking somewhere behind her. I told her my father had died 2 months earlier. I told her I had just received the probate scan. I told her I did not recognize the signature. Beulah did not gasp. She did not ask me how I was. She asked me one question. She asked me whether I still had the service photograph. I told her, yes. It was in Dad's hallway on Burgundy Street, where it had been since 2018. I had not let Rhoda move it after the funeral because, I told myself, Dad would have wanted it in his hallway. The truer reason was the small flathead screw Etta had put in the back, and the promise I had made not to open the frame unless I had to. Beulah said, in her slow, deliberate voice, that she had notarized 2 originals on the same afternoon in June of 2018. She said she had attached a thumbprint page to the 2nd original, and she said she had made a notation in her journal about a framed service photograph in case the family ever needed to find the duplicate. She told me her journal was zippered into a brown folio in a fireproof box in her closet. She told me to bring the framed photograph and meet her at the parish courthouse the next morning. The second call was to the parish clerk's office. I asked how to file an emergency objection to a probate filing. The clerk asked for the case number. I read it from the scanned document. She put me on hold for 2 minutes. When she came back, she said the matter could be added to Judge Silas Morrow's docket if I filed the objection in person and brought supporting documentation by the Wednesday afternoon cutoff. The deadline became real. Friday, 4 p.m. If the objection was not filed and ruled on by then, the forged will would control the estate long enough for Rhoda's lender to proceed. I wrote the deadline on a sticky note. I put the sticky note on the inside of the cabinet door where I keep my measuring tools. I did not put it on the wall because I did not want it to feel decorative. Rhoda called me Wednesday afternoon. She did not call to explain. She called to invite. She told me probate was going to be a closure moment and that members of the preservation committee would be there to support the family. She suggested I wear something less workroom. She used that word, workroom. She said, in the voice she used for cousins she did not particularly like, just please don't wear anything that makes us look like we don't all have the same last name. 40 minutes later, she posted a photograph on her Public Preservation Society page. She was standing in front of the empty Frenchman Street storefront she planned to buy. She held the pearl clutch she had carried at Dad's funeral. The window behind her had a small paper sign reading financing pending. The caption read, "Honoring Dad's legacy by preserving beautiful things." Lucille called me that evening from the kitchen of the house on Burgundy. She started by saying Rhoda had handled so much. She said it twice. She said it would make the family look greedy if we fought publicly over money. She did not ask me whether the signature was real. She did not ask me whether I knew anything about a duplicate will. She asked me not to embarrass Rhoda in front of the preservation committee. I told her I would not raise my voice. That was true. It was also not what she had asked. If this story is hitting close to home, comment frame below. Sometimes the truth is not missing. Sometimes someone just covered it. Now back to the story. I went to Dad's house on Burgundy that night. I let myself in with the key Dad had given me when I was 19, and he had asked me to check on the house when he traveled. The hallway smelled like old wood, valve oil, and the faint sweetness of the magnolia soap Etta used to send him from her bathroom cabinet, even though Etta had been gone 3 years. The service photograph hung where it had always hung, slightly above eye level on the wall opposite the bathroom door, in its dark walnut frame. I lifted it off the wall and carried it to the kitchen. I laid out a clean cotton cloth on the table. I placed the frame face down on the cloth. I took the brass calipers out of my bag, set them next to the frame, and unwrapped the small set of conservation screwdrivers I had brought from the museum. The first thing I noticed, without measuring anything, was that one corner of the backing sat 2 millimeters higher than the others. The paper had been cut along a seam I could only see when I tilted the frame under the kitchen light. The seam had been resealed with a thin, clear adhesive and then dusted, but not perfectly. The dust line above the seam was newer than the dust line on the rest of the frame. The frame had been opened, not by Etta, not by Dad, not by me. Recently. I felt the calipers in my hand and thought of Dad saying I would know when to use them on something more important than a trumpet case. I measured the heavy corner. The backing was thicker there by exactly the depth of an archival sleeve. I unscrewed the small flathead screw Etta had put in 3 years earlier. I lifted the backing paper carefully. With the cotton gloves I had taken from the museum the day before, I slid 2 fingers along the inside of the frame and felt the corner of the sleeve. The duplicate will was inside. 3 pages, notarized in June of 2018, signed by Miles Marchetti in his narrow, slanted hand. The triangle, M. The slight upward tail on the I. The thumbprint page, in faded blue ink, attached at the back. Behind it, folded in half, was a small handwritten note in Dad's writing. It said, "Tess fixed the case. Good hands." I did not cry then either. I read the note once. I refolded it. I placed it in the sleeve with the will. I put the will in my museum bag in a hard envelope. I put the photograph back in the frame, but I did not screw the backing down. I left it slightly loose so that the next person to open it could see what had been done. My supervisor at the museum, Nadine Boudreau, met me at the conservation table, after hours, the next night. Nadine has cropped black hair, paint on her left thumbnail from a project she should have finished 6 weeks ago, and a habit of bringing me coffee in a chipped white mug without asking whether I want it. She did not ask why I was at the table at 9 p.m., with a framed photograph and a will. She set the coffee down. She looked at the frame, then at the calipers, then at me. She said one thing: document the frame like it's an artifact, not like it's family. I photographed the front of the frame, the back, the seam, the dust line, the heavy corner, the screw, the underside of the backing paper, and the inside of the frame where the sleeve had rested. I measured everything. I wrote the measurements on an evidence log I had built that morning, in the same template I used for museum acquisitions. I labeled the file with the date, the time, the location, and the chain of custody. Then I drove home through the kind of light rain that does not need wipers. I dressed for court on Friday in a simple charcoal dress and the only pair of low heels I owned that did not pinch. I wrapped the brass calipers in a clean cloth and slipped them into the inside pocket of my bag, next to the hard envelope with the duplicate will and Beulah's name on a sticky note. Rainwater ran along the curb outside my apartment, in dark, fast streams. The air smelled of wet brick, coffee from the cafe 2 doors down, and the paper from the documents spread across my kitchen table. The framed photograph leaned against a chair, face down. I left it that way. For 11 minutes before I went out the door, I thought about settling. I thought about calling Rhoda and offering her the storefront if she gave me the trumpet archive. I thought about how much less I would have to do. I thought about the look on Lucille's face if I let Rhoda keep what she had taken without saying anything in the courtroom. I read Dad's note one more time. Tess fixed the case. Good hands. I folded it once and placed it behind the duplicate will. At 8:12 a.m., Beulah called to tell me she was already at the courthouse and would bring her notary journal up in the elevator at 9:15. At 8:26 a.m., the probate clerk left me a voicemail confirming that Judge Morrow had placed our matter on the morning docket. At 8:41 a.m., a number I did not recognize left a voicemail. It was Casper Loeb. He thought he was calling Rhoda. He said her name, then he said he wanted to confirm that the estate transfer would be clean by close of business so the lending packet could move Monday. He apologized for calling so early. He said he understood that today was emotional. He used the word emotional twice. I saved the voicemail. I labeled it with the date, the time, and the source. The hallway outside the probate courtroom smelled like lemon polish, wet wool coats, old paper, and rain that had been blown in through the courthouse doors and not yet mopped from the tile near the elevator. Shoes squeaked. Voices were lower than they would have been in any other public hallway in the city, because nobody wants to laugh too loud near a probate door. The benches inside the courtroom were harder than they looked, varnished smooth by decades of waiting hands. 86 witnesses. I counted later, not in the moment. The gallery was packed. Preservation Society members in linen jackets. 5 of Dad's former trumpet students with their parents. 3 church friends, including Ruth Penn, sitting near the aisle in her usual silver hairpin and a gray blazer. Opal Crenshaw in the 3rd row, smelling faintly of lavender hand cream even from where I sat, because Opal had sat with Dad in his last weeks and always smelled like that. 2 neighbors from Burgundy, a woman from the Parish Historical Commission. Casper Loeb, in a dark suit and polished brown shoes, his tie smoothed down too many times. And in the front row to the right, Rhoda's lender associate, taking quiet notes on a small leather pad. Rhoda sat 2 rows ahead of me in pearls and the pale blue dress. Lucille sat beside her with a tissue folded into the cuff of her sleeve. Rhoda did not turn around when I entered. She had timed her entrance to be earlier than mine, so that the preservation committee would see her first. She only touched her pearls and kept smiling. Beulah Knox sat near the aisle in the 4th row. She was wearing a navy cardigan with mother-of-pearl buttons. Her brown folio rested on her lap. 3 turquoise rings on her left hand caught the light when she folded her hands over the zipper. Rhoda's attorney spoke first. He was a thin man with a gray mustache who used the word respectfully 3 times in his opening minute. He presented the forged will as Dad's final estate document. He described Rhoda as the responsible daughter who had taken on caregiving duties. He used the phrase, "the family's understanding," twice. When Judge Morrow asked whether the family was in agreement about the disposition, Rhoda stood. She smoothed the front of her dress. She took half a breath in the way she had practiced in mirrors since she was 16. She said in her softest, most acceptable voice that her sister had been emotional since the funeral and that this was a difficult time for everyone. Then she said the line she had been planning since the day she scanned the forged will into the clerk's portal. "Tessa is a shop girl at a museum," Rhoda said. "She works with props. Dad trusted me with the real things." She said it without looking back at me. The preservation committee, sitting in the second and third rows, heard her clearly. So did Casper Loeb. So did Ruth Penn. So did Beulah Knox. So did Judge Silas Morrow, who did not look up from the file in front of him, but who allowed his right hand to rest still on the desk, in a way I would later come to understand was not a casual position. Ruth Penn closed her hymnal-sized notebook, the one she always carried for church meetings. The cover made a quiet sound against the pew. Opal Crenshaw lowered her eyes and folded her hands in her lap. Casper Loeb smoothed his tie one last time, then stopped looking at Rhoda and started looking at the document in his folder. Beulah Knox unzipped her brown folio in one slow, deliberate motion that did not interrupt the room and was somehow louder than anything else in it. I did not stand up. I did not raise my hand. I did not defend my work. I placed both feet flat on the courtroom floor and felt the calipers through the side of my bag. I counted. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The court reporter's keys clicked once. Pause here. What do you think Tessa does next? A. She walks out. B. She asks for a private meeting. C. She brings out the hidden will and the notary journal. Drop A, B, or C below, and subscribe if you haven't, because the next 10 minutes are the reason this story exists. Judge Morrow looked up from the file. He looked at Rhoda's attorney first, then at Rhoda, then at me. He removed his narrow silver glasses, folded them, set them on the bench, and asked, in the same neutral voice he had used to read the docket number, whether the court was aware of any objection from any other named party. I stood. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I have Dad's duplicate will, the frame it was hidden in, and the notary who watched him press his thumb to the page." I walked the framed service photograph to the clerk's table first. I set it down face up. The clerk lifted it carefully and turned it over. The backing was still slightly loose where I had left it. Then I walked the hard envelope with the duplicate will to the bench. Then I unwrapped the brass calipers from their cloth and set them on the wooden railing in front of the gallery, not as drama, but as explanation, the way I would set a measuring tool next to an artifact in a museum case to show scale. Beulah stood without being asked. She introduced herself as the retired notary commissioned in Orleans Parish from 1989 through 2019. She walked to the bench, opened her brown folio, and laid her notary journal open to the entry from the 14th of June 2018. The thumbprint page was tucked behind the entry in a separate sleeve, with Dad's full name typed beneath it. Judge Morrow took his time. He examined the duplicate will, page by page. He examined Beulah's seal. He examined the thumbprint page. He compared the signature on the duplicate to the signature on the forged probate filing. He asked Beulah 3 questions, one at a time, in the slow, careful way I would later see him use in every important moment. He asked her to confirm her commission. She did. He asked her to confirm the date of the signing and the persons present. She did. Miles Marchetti, Etta Karen, Beulah Knox, the 14th of June, 2018. He asked her to confirm the notation in her journal about a framed service photograph. She read the line aloud. The notation said, in her hand, "Duplicate will, sealed in archival sleeve, to be stored behind framed military service photograph, in case the primary copy becomes unavailable." Rhoda's hand left her pearls. Her right hand gripped the edge of counsel table so hard that 2 of her fingernails turned white. The color drained unevenly from her face, starting at the mouth. She did not look at me. She did not look at Lucille. She looked at the duplicate will in the judge's hand as if it were a thing she had personally seen, personally lifted, personally returned. Opal Crenshaw whispered, "He knew," and then covered her mouth with both hands. She had sat with Dad in the last weeks. She had heard him talk about both daughters. She had not understood, until that moment, what the talk had been preparing for. Ruth Penn rose halfway from her seat. Judge Morrow nodded at her once. She spoke, clearly, in the voice she used for hymns. She told the court that Dad had repeatedly told her, in conversations after church on Sundays, that he wanted Tessa to receive the family house share and the trumpet archive he had asked her to preserve, and that he wanted Rhoda to receive a separate share that would not require Tessa's signature. She named 2 dates. She named the pew they had been sitting in. The court reporter typed every word. Caspar Loeb did not stand. He simply pushed his folder slightly away from himself on the gallery bench, the way a man might push away a plate of food that has gone wrong. He stopped smoothing his tie. He did not look at Rhoda again. Rhoda tried. I will say that. She tried to find another version of the story. Her attorney rose and suggested that the duplicate must be an older draft, that Miles Marchetti had likely changed his mind in the years since 2018, that the duplicate was sentimental and not legally controlling. Rhoda herself, when invited to respond, said in a voice that climbed half an octave that I had opened a frame and invented a story to discredit her in front of the Preservation Committee. Judge Morrow listened. He did not interrupt. When the attorney finished, the judge asked one question. He asked the attorney to produce the notary record for the will Rhoda had submitted to the court. The attorney could not. The notary, listed on the forged will, when located, had no record of the signing in her journal. She had no thumbprint page on file. Her commission number had been used, but her seal had been reproduced from another document. The signature on the forged will did not match Miles Marchetti's signature on his lesson receipts, his military discharge papers, or his bank correspondence. The signature spacing differed. The slant differed. The M differed. The I differed. Judge Morrow did not raise his voice when he ruled. He said the duplicate would be entered as the controlling will. He said the forged document was set aside, pending further review. He said the estate transfer was frozen as of that moment. Then he asked me, in the same neutral voice, whether the objecting party me was requesting criminal referral and immediate notification to the lender of record. I looked at Rhoda. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the thumbprint page on the bench. I looked at Lucille. Lucille was looking at her hands. I am asking the court to stop the transfer first, Your Honor, I said. I will answer the rest after the estate is safe. The frame was opened once before I opened it. The backing showed that. So did the dust. The duplicate will showed it. So did the thumbprint. So did Beulah's journal. So did the absent notary record on the other side of the room. I could have asked, that morning, for everything. I could have asked for criminal referral, lender notification, punitive damages, a public fraud finding, the immediate collapse of Rhoda's storefront before she opened the door. I could have said yes to all of it at 11:14 a.m. The judge would have allowed every one of those questions to be filed. I did not. Paper remembers what pride edits. Judge Morrow gave me until the following Friday to file my position on next steps. He set a status hearing for 10 days out. He instructed the clerk to notify the lender of record of the freeze. He instructed Rhoda's attorney to surrender the forged document into the court file. He thanked Beulah for her testimony. He asked Ruth Penn to provide a brief written statement at her convenience. He did not look at Rhoda again before he closed the file. Rhoda did not stand up immediately when the hearing adjourned. She sat. Lucille tried to take her elbow. Rhoda pulled away. The Preservation Committee, in the second and third rows, gathered their coats too quickly and filed out of the gallery without speaking to her. Caspar Loeb left through the side door. I packed the calipers back into their cloth. I picked up the framed photograph from the clerk's table. The hard envelope with the duplicate will stayed with the court. I walked out into the hallway. The rain had stopped. The floor near the elevator had been mopped. In the next 10 days, I made the choice I had been holding back in the courtroom. I went to Judge Morrow's clerk on the Wednesday before the status hearing. I filed a position statement. I did not ask for criminal referral. I did not ask for punitive damages. I did not ask for press notification. I asked for a court-approved restitution plan. I knew what the forged will allowed me to ask for. I was not asking for all of it. The plan, when it was finalized, required Rhoda to surrender the forged document, withdraw the false probate filing, repay the estate's legal costs, issue a written apology to be entered into the estate record, and make monitored monthly payments from any antique trade revenue for 36 months. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue punitive damages. and I agreed not to oppose Rhoda's continued employment in any antique trade work that did not involve estate planning. Casper Loeb, on his own initiative, withdrew the larger storefront loan. Rhoda did not get the Frenchman Street building. She did get a smaller leased booth in a shared antique gallery on Decatur, under the monitored repayment terms. At the status hearing, Judge Morrow read the plan into the record. He asked Rhoda, on the record, whether she understood the terms. She said yes. He asked her whether she accepted the terms. She said yes. He asked her whether she had anything to say to the court. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said the only true sentence I had ever heard her say in a public room. I should not have done it. She did not look at me. She did not thank me. After the hearing, when we were both in the hallway outside the courtroom, she stood by the elevator and waited until the others had cleared. Then she walked over to me. She did not smile. Her voice was flatter than I had ever heard it. "Why would you do that?" she asked. She meant the mercy. She meant the restitution plan. She meant the missing criminal referral. She meant the booth instead of the storefront. She meant the silence I had not used as a weapon. "Because Dad taught music to people who could not pay," I said. "I know the difference between consequence and starvation." She did not answer. She got on the elevator. The doors closed. I did not follow. 6 days later, a cream envelope arrived at my apartment. Rhoda's apology letter was inside, written in careful block letters instead of her usual looping public handwriting. It was short. It said she had hidden the will. It said she had let people believe I was less because it helped her look like more. It said she did not expect me to forgive her, and she did not ask me to. I read it once at the kitchen table. The room smelled like coffee, rain, and the brass polish I had been using that morning on Dad's trumpet parts laid out on a clean towel. I did not cry over the letter. I did not write back. I placed the letter in an archival sleeve labeled Estate Correction Rhoda Glenn and filed it next to the duplicate will and the court order. I treated it like an artifact. I gave it a label. I gave it a date. I gave it a date. I did not give it more than that. 2 weeks later, Lucille called. She started by saying she had not known the will was forged. I let the silence last 9 seconds. I counted. She then said the truer sentence. She said she had not wanted to know. I told her she could come to the neighborhood exhibit when it opened. I told her she would not be allowed to speak for Dad there. She said she understood. I do not know whether she did. 10 months later, I stood alone in the museum after closing, in the small neighborhood gallery on the 2nd floor, where I had built the exhibit on Dad. The room smelled like wood polish, brass cleaner, and the faint dust of old programs from his trumpet recitals. The lights were warm and low. The case in the center held 3 things: his restored trumpet, his service photograph, returned to its frame, and properly backed by a conservator. The brass calipers, laid across a small piece of black velvet beside the trumpet. Miles. My father would have hated being called a hero. He would have called himself a teacher who happened to have served. He would have wanted the trumpet visible, the photograph visible, and the calipers labeled by their use. I had written the labels myself. The label under the calipers did not say evidence. It did not say weapon. It did not say justice. It said tools. Belonged to Miles Marchetti. Used by his daughter Tessa Marchetti in the restoration of this exhibit, Rhoda kept her booth on Decatur. She made the monitored payments for 10 months without missing one. She did not attend the exhibit opening. The Preservation Committee, which had stopped inviting her to chair events, did invite her to attend public lectures, and she came to 2 of them. She sat in the back. She did not raise her hand. Lucille came to the exhibit opening. She sat with Ruth Penn instead of with Rhoda. She mailed me 3 of Dad's old lesson ledgers she had kept in a closet on Burgundy. The note inside said only, "These were yours to know about." I filed the ledgers. I did not mistake the note for repair. Beulah Knox started teaching a free seminar at the church basement on wills, notarization, and keeping elder documents safe. 42 people attended the first session. Ruth Penn brought coffee and 2 large carafes. Opal Crenshaw brought a box of pens. Nobody called it gossip. They called it preparation. By the 3rd month, she had taught 2 more sessions and had a waiting list. She mentioned Dad once at the end of the first class. She did not name Rhoda. She said only that a duplicate kept in the right place had saved a family from losing more than a house. Casper Loeb wrote me a short letter in the second month. He apologized for not asking more questions. He said he had assumed the probate packet was clean because the family looked clean. He said he would not make that assumption again. I filed the letter in a sleeve labeled Lender Correction. Dad's trumpet archive is now under my care, in a climate-controlled cabinet at the museum, with a finding aid I wrote in 2 long weekends. 5 of his former students have donated photographs, recital programs, and handwritten exercises. The earliest exercise is from 1986. The most recent is from the month before he died. Together, they form one of the only documented neighborhood trumpet teaching collections in the city. The senior conservator told me, when I finished cataloging, that the collection would outlast both of us, and that Dad had been right to trust me with it. I funded a small restoration stipend at the museum in Etta's name. The stipend goes to a student each year who works in preservation in a community-facing role. The first recipient is a young woman from Algiers who restores hand-painted parade signs. I do not introduce myself at the award ceremony. The stipend is in Etta's name, not mine. That is the point. I am still a museum exhibit fabricator. I still sand acrylic risers. I still wear an apron with citrus dust on the front. I still bring coffee in a chipped white mug to Nadine, who pretends she does not notice I am bringing it more often. People at work still call me Tessa, not shop girl, not crafts, not props. Tessa. That is the only change that mattered. Nico, no. Dad, he would have liked the lights low in the gallery the way they are now. He would have liked the brass calipers across the velvet beside the trumpet. He would have asked, in his careful way, whether anyone had measured the case to make sure the trumpet fit without pressure on the bell. I measured it. Twice, with the same calipers he had given me at 17. The calipers are not labeled as weapons. They are labeled as tools. That matters to me. They did not punish Rhoda. They measured the place where the truth had been hidden. Etta had told me, on a rainy afternoon at her kitchen table in 2018, to measure twice when love was loud. I had measured. I had measured the frame. I had measured the signature. I had measured the dust line on the backing paper. I had measured the silence in the courtroom when Rhoda called me a shop girl. I had measured the cost of the mercy I chose, against the cost of the ruin I did not. The exhibit closes in 3 months. The trumpet will be archived with the rest of the collection. The photograph will be returned to the family home, which is now mine. The calipers will come back to my workbench, where Dad first put them in my hand when I was 17, and the latch on his trumpet case had cracked along the seam. I will keep using them. Not to prove anything, to do the work. Proof has better manners than lies. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe to By Then I Knew, and comment calipers if you have ever had to prove something everyone should have believed the first time. And if you're listening from somewhere rainy, quiet, or late tonight, tell me your city and the time. I read those.